Peter Arzt-Grabner, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
We're going to talk about papyrology. And one of the things that got me hooked on the study of early Christianity was seeing these little scraps of paper, papyrus, but paper, and realizing that from these we could find out not only about early Christianity, about people's lives, about their hopes and their dreams and their frustrations and their taxes, and all sorts of things. And we met about 10 years ago, and you were kind enough as a papyrologist to take me along and encourage me. You didn't say, who's this annoying kid who wants to know about papyrology? You encouraged me, and I came and visited you in Salzburg, and we did some papyrology together. So I'm really happy to have you here. And I think my audience hears about papyrology all the time, but there's a lot of misconceptions about it. And a lot of things, especially on the internet, people throw out these things about dates or about what this papyrus is, or, and we use them like proof texts, but people don't usually take the time to understand what papyrology is, what it can tell us about early Christianity, what its limits are. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we start, I'm curious to know what got you interested in papyrology. How did this love begin?
No, that's a very good question, because I was fascinated, fond of Greek, ancient Greek. So I had to learn it at school. I wanted to learn it at school because at the age of 15 or so, I already thought I might be interested to study theology. And in Austria, where I grew up and studied ancient Greek, at least some knowledge of it is mandatory to study theology. So I started to study theology, and only after 4 years or so, I got interested to study another field as well, which was classics. And it was kind of funny, because during my studies in the ancient Greek language, I heard about these papyri. I heard that those are the artifacts that preserve ancient literature, that preserve parts of the Bible, but I never heard about documentary papyri. And so documentary papyri are those papyri that are, I'd like to say, from everyday life. Mm-hmm. So private letters, all kinds of deeds, contracts, tax receipts, whatever. When I was a boy, thinking about ancient times, of course I thought about being Alexander the Great or someone like him. Maybe not so much Julius Caesar, because the way he ended, but so thinking about these great emperors or heroes or whatever. In the papyri, I realized I find the life illustrated, the life of those people who most probably would have been my parents, my relatives, myself. So the life of peasants, the life of craftsmen, the life of slaves, whatsoever. And that still fascinates me.
That's what's interesting to me too, is that ability to look into ordinary people's lives. And I think people misunderstand that somebody writing a book that's in our Bible or some of the early Christian literature, these are often well-educated people with some means. And it's quite a different story when you look into the lives of, you imagine the people who, like, for example, would have been in Paul's congregations, or people like this, that they just have very different lives. You can see the things they worried about, just like us, paying their taxes, or, trying to get a fair deal if they're in an argument with somebody, or these types of things. There's two big things I want to focus on. The first, I think, will be kind of short. There's a confusion over what papyrology can do and what papyrology can't do. I hang out too much on the internet, as you know, but I often hear people who have very simplistic understandings of papyrology. And I'll give you an example, and then you talk about the limits of the field. Because one of the things I hear, for example, is this famous P52, which is an early manuscript of the Gospel of John. And I will often hear people say, P52 is from year 125. And that's how we know, whatever. And they fill in the blanks with their assumptions about it. But any papyrologist listening to that knows there's a problem with that. So can you talk a little bit about that problem and then just some of the limits of papyrology?
I mean, first of all, if you look at an image of P52, or I have a chance to look at the original, you see it's a very small fragment. So there's not one complete line of a line preserved on that fragment. So the papyrus fragment is broken on 3 sides. Only the top is more or less preserved, so with a blank space, and you only have per line a few characters. So it was quite easy to identify it as being a part of John's Gospel. But so to give any serious, precise dating is really out of the way. You can't precisely date a papyrus fragment that's small. You simply don't have enough text there. Not even all the characters of the Greek alphabet. That's not very much. For a long time, the dating was about 125 CE. Yeah, more or less no serious papyrologist of today repeats that dating. But to be more serious, I would say, well, maybe it's between 125, 175, somewhere in that time frame. And that, of course, makes a huge difference, because 125 is still quite early 2nd century. 175 is kind of late 2nd century. We have to be very careful with the dating, because it's simply based on paleography. It's simply based on comparing the characters, comparing the writing. And so it's a relative dating. It's not an absolute dating, except for those manuscripts where we have the dating somewhere in the manuscript, an exact dating. So P52, yeah, it can be 125, or let's say the end of the 1st quarter of the 2nd century, but it can as well be the end of the 3rd quarter of the 2nd century. It's still a very early papyrus fragment. There's no doubt about that. But a lot depends on what you conclude from that. How did the New Testament evolve? When did it start? When was the first volume published by a professional publisher and then spread around? We often have this very romantic idea. See, the letters of Paul, they were the originals, then they were collected, then these early Christ groups, they made these copies and maybe had a copy on loan to get their own copy. That's a very romantic view. Commerce is also a very important part of that. Also illustrated again by papyri from everyday life, how were books produced. There was nothing religious, there was nothing spiritual. That was a matter of commerce, that was a matter of trade, that was a matter of money. How much money did you have to get your own copy for your group? Did you have only the money to get a copy of the volume on the Gospels, or the other volume on the letters of Paul as well? And then there was a 3rd volume on Acts and the Catholic epistles, and there was a 4th volume on Revelation. So we really have to get rid of that idea, by the end of the 1st century or 2nd century, these communities, they all had their Bible. No, there was nothing like a Bible in a community, in a Christ group, no matter if it was Corinth or just a small village that had for the entire community a complete edition of the New Testament. That didn't start earlier than the 2nd century. And I'm not talking about beginning of the 2nd century, but maybe mid-2nd century, around that time.
So you alluded there to dating. So essentially, unless we're really lucky and some piece of paper either has a date on it that says in the such and such year of such and such Caesar, then we can say, okay, well, that's year 67 or something. And sometimes even the month, or in the day. But otherwise, with these scraps, what we do is, you said the word paleography, which is a big word, but it's the study of handwriting. And we look at how handwriting evolves over time and how letters change. And if a papyrologist looks at these things all the time and sees, well, okay, well, this person is writing the same way as this person, and in this letter we have a date, and in this letter of Paul, for example, there's no date because literature doesn't usually have dates in it. That's kind of how we make dating, and then we build a window of dating based on the evolution of writing.
I mean, when you find a dating of an undated papyrus to a particular year, I would recommend forget about it. Yeah, that's not serious. No one can do it.
Yeah, nobody can do that.
Nobody can do that.
Yeah.
At least it has to be something like the quarter of a century. That's quite precise.
Yeah, even that's pretty optimistic.
That's pretty optimistic in most cases. Sometimes it works when we know that there was a reform in the writing style, in how to write the characters.
Really?
But these are only a few cases. Most of the cases, the datings are a particular century, or even in the frame of 2 centuries or even 3 centuries. That's serious.
Yeah. Why don't we move on to what we can get from papyri? Because this is the subject of a lot of your work. And this is where actually the way that papyrology is often used as these types of proof texts for things undermines the fact that papyri is really useful in a way that people don't always pay attention to. We're going to talk mostly about Paul, and you've done a lot of work studying ancient letters and what they tell us about Paul. So before we get to some of the content of Paul's letters and the way that papyri have helped us understand different things, why don't we start by what studying papyrology taught you about how Paul probably lived his life and how Christianity probably spread with Paul?
I'd like to start with 2 aspects that are very important and that have often been brought forward as a critique on the use of papyri. So most of the papyri, they come from Egypt. That's still the case. For obvious reasons, Egypt has a dry climate, and papyrus can only survive in a dry climate. So wherever it rained during the last 2 millennia, you won't find any papyrus because it got rotten in the soil. The ancient Egyptians, they were very wise. So along the Nile, they were doing agriculture. Wherever they could irrigate their fields, their ground was ready to do some agriculture, to grow fruits, vegetables, whatever. Only behind these fields, they built their villages. And the back of the villages, so where there was already a desert, they damped their, they could say, old paper. They dumped their garbage. And that's the main source where to find papyri, where to excavate papyri nowadays. Where these famous guys, Grenfell and Hunt, first they started to excavate the city of Oxyrhynchus, and they didn't find anything.
Yeah.
But when they started to excavate the rubbish dumps, they found around 500,000 papyrus fragments.
Yeah.
So only a few come from libraries, only a few papyri come from houses, were found inside houses. Most of them were found in rubbish dumps. So we papyrologists, we are kind of these strange guys who are doing research on the garbage of ancient times and looking into the trash that was never supposed to be read by anyone again. For a long time, there was an idea, a hypothesis that in German was called Sonderfall Ägypten, so the special case of Egypt. Because from Egypt we already had this papyri, from all the other provinces of the Roman Empire we had inscriptions and no papyri. And so scholars thought, well, there's a big difference between what we find on inscriptions and what we find on papyri. So Egypt was special. Egypt was different to the rest of the Roman provinces. Meanwhile, we also have papyri from Israel, we have some from Syria, we have some individual artifacts found in Afghanistan, even in Iran. We have the famous Derveni papyrus and other papyrus fragments that were found in Greece. And we have also papyri that were written elsewhere, like in Rome or the port of Rome or in Ravenna, and brought to Egypt. In general, we see that what is preserved on the papyri from Egypt is the case for the entire Roman Empire. So when we now come to Paul, although Paul probably never was meant to Egypt, I don't know, but I don't think so. But the situation in Tarsus, where he grew up, the situation in Roman Judea, the situation in Corinth, was basically the same as in the papyri in Egypt. And also the other way around is important. The letters of Paul and other texts of the New Testament, if they show similarities with papyri from Egypt, those are sources that are not from Egypt. So when we find similarities of epistolary formula in papyrus letters from Egypt and in Paul, Paul is the proof that what we find in the papyri from Egypt was common all over the Roman Empire. The second point that I would like to mention, it's often thought that this papyri, especially when you look at letters, is a very short documents, very basic, even poor educated people wrote those documents. But the longest private letter preserved in the original only on papyrus now has the length of Galatians.
Oh, wow.
So that's the other end of the scale, of course. It's exceptional, sure. That's a very special case. But we have several letters of highly educated people, longer letters. We also have short letters with a very sophisticated language, well comparable with Paul. So it's not true that we have only attested the life of poor people, of peasants. We also have papyri, and original papyrus letters by a philosopher. He is entitled as philosopher on that letter. Not so many, but that's what the situation was in those days. Not so many were part of the elite. Not so many were part and had received high education. Some did. I'm sure Paul did receive high education. But what is now exciting and what we see when we look at his letters and compare those to thousands of papyrus letters, there are more than 7,000 papyrus letters edited so far, we see through the comparison that Paul obviously knew which formulae to use that were understood by pretty much any reader of that time. So anyone who was in a basic way familiar with writing a letter could immediately understand when Paul used a formula that was comparable with it. Most prominently, the Thanksgiving report at the beginning of many of Paul's letters. It is still comparable, understandable, when you know what the Thanksgiving report in a common papyrus letter was like. The difference is, of course, Paul is offering thanks to the one God. Paul is offering thanks not for the health and for the good news about the health of his addressee, but about the good situation, the health, and the spiritual life of the community. But you realize the convention, and you immediately see, that's when they received the letter by Paul, they immediately realized, that's the formula and that's the intention behind it. We are on good terms with Paul. Whereas in Galatians, you immediately realize, because what you were used to this formula, their relationship is in trouble. Of course, Paul was not only a letter writer, he was also a craftsman. There's a lot to learn about Paul's craft from the papyri. There's a lot to learn about networks. There's a lot to learn about letter carriers, about how to structure a community, etc., etc.
Tell me about his craft. What was a tent maker's life, and what can we learn from papyri? And I know tent maker might not be the right translation, but
as everyone knows who has just once read Acts, that at a particular spot in the book of Acts, Paul is called a tent maker. Actually, not Paul himself is called a tent maker. The text, in fact, reads that there was Aquila and Prisca. And Paul was working the same craft as them, and they were tent makers. So, of course, we think he is also a tent maker. We don't have any evidence about tent makers in the papyri, but what we have is a huge evidence about what weavers were doing. So about the weavers' craft.
The weavers,
And it was really amazing for me when I first saw that a particular verse in the letter to Philemon has an exact analogy in apprenticeship contracts for weavers. So before that, we thought, well, we have only this attestation in Acts. Paul was a tent maker. We don't have anything from Paul himself. He's not writing in any of his letters about his craft. So from himself, we don't really know. Probably he was a tent maker because Luke says so. In Philemon, Paul uses, regarding this slave Onesimus, a phrase which reads kind of, I wanted to keep him, Onesimus, the slave of Philemon, I wanted to keep him with me so that he might serve me in the gospel. Diakoneo is the Greek term for serve, which in the first century is in the documentary papyri, only preserved in apprenticeship contracts with weavers.
Wow.
Not earlier, not later, exactly during the first century. Not in any other apprenticeship contract, only for the craft of weavers. Oh, wait a minute, that's Paul's craft. So that's such a particular phrase and exactly used in apprenticeship contract where, for instance, the father of a son who is apprenticed to a weaver master, both agree with each other, the father and the weaver master, that the son will stay with the weaver for a year, for 2 years, whatever the contract says, so that he, the son, who was to be apprenticed, would serve the master in everything according to the weaver's craft. And we have diakoneo. And Paul has, I wanted to keep Onesimus with me so that he might serve me in the gospel.
So it's a clue.
Paul's craft on his mission is spreading the gospel. But he knows about the formula from apprenticeship contracts with weavers. He knows about this clause with diakoneo, etc. And so when you imagine Paul being trained in Tarsus as a weaver, probably in the workshop of his father, we see where this phrase comes from. 2 of my colleagues in Papyrology then told me that, Paul must have been the master of a workshop. I thought, well, Paul was apprenticed, learned the weaver's craft. That's how he heard about this contract, learned about that, and now uses it in a different way, maybe a metaphorical way. They reminded me, an apprentice is not interested in what the contract says.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. He only goes there, he is ordered to work, he is ordered to do this or that. Only the entrepreneur knows how to file the contract and is interested about the conditions and to keep them, because otherwise he is fined. So Paul must have run the family workshop in Tarsus. So now we can imagine that Paul ran the family workshop in Tarsus.
Yeah.
Maybe his father died, and as the oldest son, he took over and ran this workshop and got trained in it. Maybe even Philemon was a weaver.
Yeah.
Maybe he was not a farmer and having a lot of slaves working in the fields. Maybe Philemon too ran a weaver's workshop.
To recognize the convention, he'd have to have some familiarity with it.
Right.
Yeah.
And in addition, finally we get an idea how kind of Paul's network worked. Because Tarsus was famous for a particular way of weaving textiles. In the 2nd century CE, the Tarsicarius, so the weaver who is trained in this special way that was invented in Tarsus, is known in the papyri from Egypt. So someone from Tarsus must have gone to Egypt in the 1st century or even earlier, because in the 2nd century it's already a well-known craft, a specialty of the weaving industry.
And in demand as well. Weavers from Tarsus were in demand in
So
Egypt.
we know that Paul
Yeah.
went, when he came to a new city, he tried to find some work. So now we can imagine, Paul did not just go maybe to a weaving workshop asking for work, offering his abilities.
Like with his hand out, trying to find a job sort of thing. But
Or could tell the weaver master in Corinth or in Thessaloniki, I am a weaver from Tarsus. I am a professional trained in the special type of weaving from Tarsus. Are you interested? I could teach you apprentices. I could teach yourself. So he was a professional.
he was in demand,
craftsman.
as we say. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. So that gives us a way to imagine what he's doing in these cities. Let's get into some of the comparables from the letters that help us understand things in his letters. One of the things I think people would be interested in, because often if we've just read Paul, you wouldn't realize this, but when you read Papyri, you can see situations where there are high emotions, just like in Paul's letters. People get frustrated. People get angry that they're not following their directions. People swear, which Paul swears. You said that, and I didn't really clue into that before. Can you talk about some of those examples of how to write letters with emotion, that whether it's expressing frustration? What has the Papyri taught us about what Paul is doing in his letters?
Yeah, also this is so fascinating and funny with the Papyri. For a long time, because of philosophical texts, whatever, because of literature, people thought there were almost no emotions in ancient times. Yeah. When we look at the Papyri, there are lots of emotions.
Yeah.
There's a particular papyrus letter, which was among the first letters from Oxyrhynchus edited. So in the first volume of the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, it was written by a boy to his father. And the text runs as follows. So this little Theon is writing to his father Theon, and then just greetings, because in ancient letters there was always an opening greeting, so different from nowadays. In fact, the most common greeting is the Greek infinitive chairein, which means to rejoice.
Yeah.
And the earliest forms of that formula, the verb is still preserved and has directly to do with the term for a letter. It's the Greek verb epistello. Epistle comes from that verb, which just means to send or to order, to send something to someone. So this common greeting tells us a lot about letter writing, because a letter is sent from someone to another person and should be a reason to rejoice. Though we can't be together right now and meet in person, I'm thinking of you, I'm sending you a letter which should be a reason for you to rejoice.
Yeah.
Paul, of course, has his own version with Charis Kairene, grace of God and peace.
Yeah.
This boy, Theon, uses simply the term Chairene to his father.
To write to his dad.
But what he writes afterwards is nothing to rejoice. Because we learn that the father obviously has left for Alexandria. So the family was living in the country. The father has left for the city of the province, the capital of the province of Egypt, to Alexandria. And in a very cynical way, he tells his father, "You have done so well. You did not take me with you to the big city, to Alexandria." And then he complains, "If you do not take me with you, I will not send you a letter anymore. I will not take your hand. I will not greet you. Even your wife, my mother, told," and there's a name there, obviously the son of little Theon, the brother of little Theon. "Even your wife said to this brother, 'Take him away,' which means that the brother should take little Theon away outside. He is annoying me all the time." So he even tells the father, "Your poor wife is so annoyed by me, but because of you, because you did not take me with you." And then he even finishes with, "If you do not take me with you, I will not drink, I will not eat, that's it." So he will go on hunger strike.
Such a typical child temper tantrum, really.
I mean, no comment necessary.
Yeah.
No comment necessary at all. So only in the end, he turns back to do a nice final greeting and hoping that father will return and pick him up and take him with him to the city. So that's a very, very nice, even lovely example of a boy. It's timeless.
Yeah.
There are lots of other examples. For instance, a rather long letter from a husband to his wife and her parents. And this guy is obviously on some duties, maybe in Alexandria, because they have some difficulties, and he is trying to fix it. There's some lawyers, so we don't hear about the exact troubles that they have. Of course, they knew about everything. It was not necessary to inform them, to repeat what was going on. And so in a very friendly way, he tells his wife, "I hope that you are doing well. And if you like to do some shopping, just go and buy something nice for you," really in that way. And "I'm thinking all the time of you, and I'm hoping that things will work out here." And then there's already a health wish at the end, already a final greeting, something like that. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the line, he turns around completely. In the middle of the line, he has already turned the papyrus. He's already continuing on the back of the papyrus. And then he says in a very cynical way, "Although I'm doing so much for you and thinking for you all the time, you have not even once sent me a letter. There were even people coming from you to me. I was asking them about you. If you did not give them a letter, a note for me, and you told them, 'No, we don't have time.'" So you realize he tried to be friendly and calm all the time. But in the end, before he finishes the letter,
He says what he's really thinking.
his anger
Yeah.
starts to evolve.
Yeah.
He can't stop without finally opening up and telling his wife, I'm really angry at you. I'm really frustrated.
Yeah. And this is exactly what we see in Paul, right? These two examples. Can you talk about how they help us understand what Paul is doing? And some of the words even, I think, are similar.
Yeah, well, so there was the idea regarding 2 Corinthians that there still is the idea that 2 Corinthians, the canonical version of it, which we have in our Bibles today, is a compilation of at least 2 letters by Paul. And one of the arguments for that was that at the beginning of chapter 10, we have all of a sudden a shift in emotions. So chapters 1 through 9 are quite friendly, and chapters 10 through 13, Paul is angry, Paul is frustrated, whatever. In fact, if you look at that, the break is not that big. So verse 1 of chapter 10 does not start with anger. And what you see in the papyri, when you look into original preserved papyri, that a break, a shift in emotions sometimes happen. So that's not a really strong argument for a compilation. In fact, nowadays, the arguments others that work much better. The scholars look at the situations behind the chapters. And when you realize that situations are described that can't happen at the same time, you have to think about different situations of writing, at least regarding the time.
So coming back to an example, can you give me an example of where Paul uses words like this in his letters, like this kind of emotional manipulation almost, to say like, I'm trying to think of where we see it, but you can maybe draw the line between them.
In 2 Corinthians, Paul writes that he's writing in tears.
Yeah.
So that's something also attested in papyrus letters, that someone is writing in tears because he is moved, he is in these deep emotions of sorrow, of struggle, when writing a letter to the other person. So as a kind of a very, very intimate emotion and relationship with the addressee. Yeah.
That's cool. Can you maybe give us one more example of something you found in papyri that helped you? I know your book is full of them, so for anybody who's interested, they can find your book. And you have, how many letters do you translate in there? There's a lot. The letters are, is it 100?
There's a bit more than 100, almost 130 letters that are presented in full.
Yeah, so you
translation.
Translated these into English, commented on them, and it's a great use for anybody. Maybe not for the average reader just to dip in, maybe, but for anybody who's studying the New Testament, like this is a kind of necessary to understand what's happening in Paul's letters. Can you give us another example of one of those letters that was really interesting to you?
Yeah, a very nice observation is regarding Galatians. Of course, we know that there's no Thanksgiving. People like to say the Thanksgiving in Galatians is missing. I think that's a wrong perception. It's not missing because there's no reason to give a Thanksgiving there. It's always related to good news from the current addressee and good news about the physical health. Paul, of course, has his own version of this Thanksgiving report. He thanks God for the good condition, the faith, the spiritual well-being of the community, of the Christ group, of his addressees. Every time when Paul is using the Thanksgiving report, we have somewhere in the letter a mention of receiving good news. And that's the same convention as in the papyrus letters. The most amazing example is Romans. You know, there's a Thanksgiving report in Romans. But we think that Paul did not visit the Christ groups in Rome before. The letter to Romans was kind of his introduction to the groups there. There was definitely no letter that he received earlier, no good news that he could have received from Rome. What does he tell them? It's heard all around the cosmos and the entire world. It is heard, and now I just phrase it, how great you are in your faith. Mm-hmm. Paul received good news because everyone everywhere is talking about these great Romans and their faith.
Yeah.
In Galatians, I'm sure the Christ groups in Galatia, they realized right at the beginning, our relationship with Paul is in trouble.
Yeah.
Because there Paul uses the phrase, I am surprised, I am astonished, I wonder how this or that. And that's the particular phrase used in papyrus letters when the relationship is in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the end of Galatians 6 verse 11, there's the phrase, look in what large letters I'm writing to you in my own hand. This phrase, I'm writing in my own hand, is not attested in any papyrus letter. Mm. It's attested only in legal documents. And there is no change in handwriting combined with that formula.
This is the famous theory that maybe Paul couldn't see very well, so he's writing with big letters or something.
Big letters because of poor eyesight
defect or something.
Or he was working in an unheated workshop during winter. His fingers were not able to write nicely.
Yeah.
Things like that. That's pure speculation.
Yeah.
But the point is that, yes, the formula I am writing with my own hand is attested, but only in legal documents, not in letters. And there's a good reason why we don't find it in original letters. You could see the change in handwriting very easily. Mm. You just had to look at the papyrus.
Yeah, that's right. Why would you say that?
Oh, that's a different handwriting.
Like, this is different.
Because it was not the book hand, it was this cursive hand.
Yeah.
Everyone had his individual writing style.
Yeah.
So it was visible there.
Yeah.
So the idea is that this verse 11 was interpolated by the publisher. Mm. And the publisher makes the readers of the published edition of Paul's letter collection to think that he, the publisher, had still access to the original. He could see the change in handwriting. He could see Paul's own handwriting. Now he interpolates and nicely tells the readers, look, see with what letters I'm writing to in my own hand. That doesn't make sense for any reader of an original papyrus letter. But in this way, it is preserved in the published edition that there was a change in handwriting. Otherwise, we wouldn't know that from that point onwards until the end of the letter, Paul was writing himself.
Mm. So it's a way of authenticating the materials and confirming that. Yeah.
All right.
One more, as you were talking about Galatians, there was one more thing that I loved in the book. And this was the famous verse in English. It's translated something like, "Oh, foolish Galatians."
Yeah.
But you use the example from Papyri that it should be translated as something like "you idiots" or "you're stupid" or something.
No. It's a very strong term. So the record for that is not very broad. Mm. Actually, for that particular term, there's only one papyrus using this anoetoi, this foolish.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I thought there was more
idiots.
Okay.
Yeah,
yeah.
So it's really a very, very strong, maybe even offensive term that Paul uses here. Differently from another term that he uses for kind of you stupid people, mm-hmm. which he uses in the Corinthian correspondence. That's attested much more broadly. Yeah. So in Greek the term boros. this term, and of course that tells a lot. You only have one papyrus. Maybe we will find a few others because every year new papyri are found, new papyri are edited, but so far we have only one reference for that, for a very strong term telling someone you are completely stupid, you maniac, you idiot.
Yeah, this is such nice things to say to people in letters. Well, as we wrap up, maybe one final question. What would you say to somebody who's thinking of studying the New Testament? And I know you have a body of work to prove this. A lot of it's in German, so some of my audience doesn't read German, but you've overseen the publication of an entire commentary series, book by book, on papyrological commentary on the New Testament with exactly these types of things that you can see how much papyri illuminates Paul it's everything. It's the whole New Testament. Maybe I'd be curious to know just one final reflection on why you think more New Testament scholars should pay more attention to papyri, because often I've been to a lot of these conferences and most of us are just looking at texts, or most of us are even just looking at the critical edition of a text, like very even text criticism, but a lot of us aren't paying attention to papyrology. What would you say to that?
One of the most important advantages of papyrology and studying papyri, according to my personal opinion, is that we are dealing with originals. Contrary to literature, we have the originals. So we really can see what was going on. We don't need to speculate so much.
Yeah.
I love to tell my audiences I'm not a theologian. I have so much to do with what is preserved in the original. I don't need to dive into speculations. So papyri can really help to have a material for the context of the writings of the New Testament. And so the really preserved context, of course that's only one context. We also have archaeology and other ways of studying the context of the world where the New Testament was written and published. I also like to explain it this way: the papyri from everyday life, they kind of help you ground the Word of God. Oh, of course, that's a very, very high term, the Word of God.
That's very, yeah.
That's what we call the Bible, right? But the authors, they were human beings.
Yeah.
They had their troubles. They had their problems. So, and Paul is a perfect example for that. It's long known in New Testament and entire biblical studies that even the letters of Paul, which are often regarded as high theology, are real letters sent by an individual letter writer to a particular community, paying attention to the individual problems and situations of that community. Of course, you can realize that when you really read the Bible. Just look at how Paul deals with people still attending idol meals in Corinth and in Rome. It's right the opposite what Paul tells them, the Romans and the Corinthians. That's not a contradiction of the Word of God. That's just paying attention to the individuals. And in the papyri, we are dealing all the time with individual situations. They are always individual. The Bible was written, the different writings, at a particular time by individual authors. There was no Holy Spirit dictating to these authors what to write. There was no verbal inspiration, definitely not. That's not even the message or the teaching of the church anymore.
Yeah.
Those were human beings, but who tried, of course, to do their best. And for me, that's much more important, much more inspiring, much more moving to realize, those were people like me, like you. We are all human beings. The troubles and also solutions to the troubles that we find in this text 2,000 years ago, be it the Bible, be it a documentary papyri, be in Greek or Latin literature, is quite the same. We have the computer, we have the internet, now we have AI, but we still have the same problems in our relationships. We still have same troubles in believing in a God, whatever. So it's really good to look on both sides. What was going on in life, and life is such a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
We have our troubles, but we also have our choice.
Yeah.
And sometimes we find a solution or an inspiration in the Bible. Sometimes we can even find an inspiration in a papyrus letter or in a slave sale contract.
Yeah.
So the sky is the limit.
The sky's the limit. Yeah. Well said. Well, with that, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Chris. It was a real pleasure for me.